Okay then, we're not back for what these days passes for a lecture. And this one is called A Pill for Every Ill. And it's about how modern medicine, for all its impressive successes, seems to me to have lost its way. If you've heard me talk before, you'll have some idea what I'm going to be banging on about, so you might want to take an aspirin. If you haven't, well, you might want to take one anyway, because we're treating symptoms here. No, wait, that's what we're not doing. And in a significant degree, that's what I think the problem is with modern medicine, that as it has become more technically accomplished, it has lost sight not so much of what it's trying to do as who it's trying to do it to. And this has created some very troublesome consequences, partly when it fails, and even more, in my view, when it succeeds. Now, modern medicine does fail surprisingly often, and I want to talk a bit about the ways that it fails. And some of these are not its fault. We all die eventually. Medicine is hard. Let's be honest here. It's like in sports contests, right? Sometimes the reason your team loses is the other ones get paid too. But there are some lessons, I think, to be drawn from the kind of things that medicine has not done that perhaps it might have been able to, as well as those that simply indicate the limits of the possible. And to my way of thinking, one of the major ways in which medicine has failed to do things it might otherwise have done is that it has forgotten what it's trying to do. It's forgotten who it's trying to treat. It has come to see human beings not as embodied souls, but as ghosts in a machine. And it is trying at one and the same time to fine-tune the machine and banish the ghost. And that's just not going to end well, no matter what happens along the way. For instance, you remember those old fears of a truth serum? I think what gives us the cold robies about that isn't the fact that the hero or the heroine will tell the bad guys what they're trying to find out, and thus the plot will end badly. It's the thought that if injected with such a thing, we might be simultaneously there and not there. Our memories would be there. In some odd way, our volition would be there, but they would be uncoupled. And we would cease to be human while continuing to function at a high level, giving an accurate account of what it is that the villains wanted to know. That's a very spooky scenario. And it would depend upon medicine doing a successful thing in completely the wrong way, in misapprehending entirely the nature of the thing that it was trying to treat, or, of course, in the case of the evil regime, I suppose, substituting their vision of what man is for an older and, in my view, much healthier and more truthful vision. And again, stop me if you've heard this one. You can't. I see your hand. No, I don't. One of the difficulties in conveying this point of view is one that I've talked about before, and that is it's hard to get people to see defects in the present because of this pervasive bias in our minds against the past, for modernity, and particularly for the unseen future, which we know will be even better. People think the Middle Ages were terrible, they think everything's great now, and they think everything is going to be absolutely sublime in the future. We shall create the New Jerusalem in this world, and when we do, the medicine cabinet will be very well stocked. And so if you talk about the fact that maybe we've gone wrong and things might have been better in the past, the first thing you'll have flung in your face is dentistry. As I've mentioned before, the strange theory of the evolutionists that nature created the human body as a perfect machine, all of which would wear out around the same time at perhaps age 60 or age 70, except your teeth, which all fall out at age 32. But I also had a conversation once with Milton Friedman, how's that for a name drop, where he said, you can't possibly like the past better than the present. He lived, of course, to be quite an old man, and he said, I would already be dead. I was saved by heart surgery. And so people say, well, back in the past, it wouldn't have been heart surgery. And if you judge the present solely by what it's done for you, and if you're one of the people who has, in fact, benefited from modern medical techniques, then yes, there is a certain argument that your life has been prolonged. But of course, there are people whose lives are not prolonged by medical techniques. And we need to talk about that as well. And in doing so, let us remember that impressive as, say, a heart transplant is, the great achievements of modern medicine have not really been on the high end. They haven't been in the super impressive laser beam kind of stuff. They have been in the dramatic reduction of infant mortality due to better hygiene, which, as I said last time, is to the credit of engineers, in practical terms, at least as much as doctors, although doctors did tell us don't drink from the Broad Street pump, and they were right about that. And so at one point, the British Medical Journal asked about the greatest medical advances of modern times, and the top item on the poll was sanitation. Second was antibiotics, but as you know, this one is slipping through our fingers. Third is anesthesia. Okay, I'll take that one. Fourth, vaccines. Yes, also just about an unalloyed good. Fifth, discovery of the DNA structure. Well, Dr. Moreau is very excited about that. Sixth, germ theory. Okay, also, yes, that's a good one. 7, oral contraception. And to me, this was a classic. The news story reporting this went on to say, the pill, which became widely available in the 1960s, was a medical and social phenomenon. For women who use it correctly, oral contraception can be up to 99% effective. Great. Up to 99% effective. Now, of course, people play fast and loose with statistics. Does that mean in the course of a year, if 100 women are using the pill and using it correctly, only one will get pregnant? Even that would be a little bit like playing maternity ward roulette. But what if it's each time you do the deed? How long does it take before your odds of getting pregnant using the pill correctly are better than 50-50? Yeah, it's around 50. So that's a little bit scary. But never mind. Sexual liberation, it's the best. As Malcolm Muggeridge said, we are to die in the spirit and be born again in the flesh. And it better work because we're running short of other possibilities. But I digress. So, what are the other things that people have come up with? Evidence-based medicine. A term coined in the early 1990s. So there, the great advances of medicine are pretty recent. Medical imaging. Yeah, that's actually pretty good. The X-ray and the CAT scan, that stuff. 10, computers allow ready access to information, including patient records. Well, judge for yourself how that's going. Then oral rehydration therapy. Yeah, I like that one. Risks of smoking. Not bad. Immunology. I know the history of immunology. When Edward Jenner found people could be immunized against smallpox. I don't know, we've already got vaccines. And then chlorpromazine. Discovered in 1952, it's the first antipsychotic medication, and then tissue culture. Anyway, all valid points, some more so than others. But, what have we really accomplished? And of course, one of the things we really haven't accomplished, which is very much on our minds right now, is the viral equivalent of antibiotics. And that's not because doctors are stupid or researchers are lazy or any of the other things one might allege. It's just really hard. But again, you want a pill for every ill. And people go to the doctor and say, I'm sick, give me a pill. And often the doctor's like, I've got to get this person out of my office. Sure, here's a prescription. We think, in the popular we, that medicine really has cured the viruses as well as the bacteria. Don't always know what they are. I remember at one point Hillary Clinton talked about antibiotic resistance and thought it was the people, not the diseases. So we haven't cured ignorance either, but that's another story. The fact is, there are a lot of diseases that medicine is still struggling with, like SARS-CoV-2. What else have we got here? Well, we're hoping to solve that one. There was a news story about how Warren Buffett is giving away most of his fortune, and mostly to the Gates Foundation. They have to give it all away, so that's good. I like that, but that's not about the medicine. That basically, he wants them to spend money searching for cures to childhood diseases and to improve the American education system. Well, that's low-hanging fruit. But after the announcement that he was going to do this, Bill Gates said, quote, there is no reason we can't cure the top 20 diseases. You see, so the mentality there is, okay, if we haven't cured the viral ones, we're just going to. Onwards and upwards, Excelsior. So there's no humility there, and also I think a failure to grasp quite what the nature of the problem is. Now, it's interesting that Joseph Schumpeter, so in the mid-20th century, it was in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy? Yes, it was. Okay, it's an odd place for it, but there you are. He said, the victories, not yet completely won, but in the offing over cancer, syphilis, and tuberculosis will be as much capitalist achievements as motor cars or pipelines or Bessemer steel have been. Rawr. And yeah, both syphilis and tuberculosis have tended to yield to the antibiotics, although, as you know, the antibiotics are now yielding to the diseases. We pushed our luck on that one, as humans will do, and it didn't hold up. But cancer, we don't seem close to a cure for cancer. Again, there are just things that are difficult. Fair enough. And one thing that contributes to this kind of thinking, and worse, Dorothy Sayers talked about this in The Mind of the Maker. She said, we think of our illness as a kind of crossword of which the answer is known to somebody. The complete solution must be there somewhere. It is the doctor's business to discover and apply it. But, she says, the physician is not solving a crossword. He is performing a delicate, adventurous, and experimental creative act. And again, one that will, in the final analysis, fail. Sooner or later, a doctor is going to say of you, I now pronounce this person dead, no matter how good medicine gets. And people dream about cyborgs and stuff, and there's a nightmare all its own, but frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. Now, those of you who were not here for the last talk will remember how I talked about the mockery of 18th century medicine that I encountered while walking my dog in Eric Metaxas's Amazing Grace, this biography of William Wilberforce. And yeah, it's all audiobooks all the time, because once I got done with Wilberforce, I teed up C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And he has a lot to say on my subject, which I will steal and say instead, particularly in his last chapter in that book, where he compares magic with science. And you might think this is an insulting comparison, but all you magicians put your hands down. The point that Lewis makes is that there was actually very little magic in those terrible Middle Ages. They had their share of superstition and perhaps a little more. But this active kind of hocus-pocus stuff, the real dream that we would conquer nature that way, is a distinctly Renaissance phenomenon, like witch burning. And he says this is illogical because it's in the Renaissance that science, as Bacon advocated, ceased to be valued for its own sake and became instead a kind of instrument of power. And as Lewis points out, in taking that approach, we unleash this process where just as we finally conquer nature, it conquers us, because we abolish rationality, we abolish absolute truth, and we are reduced to acting on whatever whim nature has implanted in us at this critical moment. The other thing that Lewis says, in a weird way, I think, rehabilitates alchemy. By which I do not mean they turned dross into gold. In some ways, metaphorically, they thought they did, and perhaps they were wrong. But no, the point is, as Lewis himself says, that chemistry and alchemy are twins. One is healthy and one is sickly. And chemistry flourishes and goes on to a brilliant career, and alchemy withers and dies. And the rehabilitation of alchemy is precisely this, that alchemy, like chemistry, was evidence-based. It used the experimental method, and it recorded its observations, it tested its theories against the evidence, and in the end, it vanished because its experiments failed. It did not discover reliable laws that gave you power over nature, and chemistry flourished because it did. It really is a kind of magic. It's just magic that really works. I was going to put in some snide comment about the idea of turning base metal into gold, that the government still thinks it can do so and is handing out non-existent money in the belief that it will suddenly become real. But I'm not here to talk about economics, so be thankful for small mercies, because believe me, I could. Instead, I want to make the point that alchemy failed and closed up shop precisely because it was experimental and evidence-based, just like chemistry. The only problem is it didn't work, so out it goes. And again, to give modern medicine its due, it is an offspring of the healthy twin, right? Chemistry and related sciences begat medicine. And being based upon chemistry, medicine and physics and biology and so forth, the hard sciences, medicine does a lot of things that work. Though, as I said last time, it's surprising how many of them really date to the 20th century. More, I think, because they were hard than because of any failure of imagination, nerve, or intellect. But again, there are a lot of things that medicine has failed to do, including protect seniors from the COVID-19 epidemic. And you can blame anybody you like for that, and there's a lot of blame to go around. But there are other things too. When I was much younger, I suffered from both asthma and eczema. And you know what? Medicine couldn't cure either of them. And it still can't. It can treat the symptoms and hope they go away. And in my case, I'm pleased to say for the most part it did. But again, there are a lot of things that medicine can't do just because it's wonderful. As I also mentioned last time, when Sir William Osler, the pioneering Canadian medical doctor and theoretician, when he was teaching at McGill at the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 4 drugs and one of them was mercury. So perhaps there were only 3 drugs. So then it all came along, we got surgery, we spilled moldy bread into a petri dish, all kinds of things happened, and they really did work. And though I spoke earlier about cancer, but of course it is true that nowadays there are a lot of kinds of cancer where you can either get the thing under control or indeed get rid of it and live a long and happy life until you die of something else, or, it comes back when you're 83, at which point it's hard to have a grievance, though I'll revisit that point when I'm 82. But of course there are other forms of cancer where the doctor says, I'm really, really sorry about this, but no, we can't. Or the course is unpredictable. I did know somebody who was given 6 months to live and lived for 5 years, but of course, other people have the opposite experience. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can't do. Another point that I wanted to raise was, this is from a piece in Comment magazine about utilitarianism. And he said, one of the symptoms of this utilitarian ethic is the ubiquitous use of what the healthcare management industry calls quality-adjusted life years as one of the primary justifications for deciding how resources should be allocated. And of course, that's not irrational. You have to make some kind of decision about how to allocate resources. But at the same time, there is the formally forbidden interpersonal utility comparisons when you have to decide your life stinks, you don't get the treatment. And I think, as you can see in any senior's home, there's this insight that there's a big difference, a la Crudes, between living and just plain not dying. But at the same time, because of the irrationalities of the calculation and other things, we spend a lot of time and resources in medicine keeping bodies alive from which life really has departed. And that is because there is something wrong with our understanding of the human being and of letting nature take its course. And so you're going to find at one and the same time this preposterous use of heroic measures to keep people alive whose time has come, and euthanasia. Something's not right in this picture, and it isn't just that we can't yet cure Alzheimer's. And it gets worse. It gets a lot worse. This is a story from the National Post. This is in 2001, so maybe you're going to tell me, okay, that was then, it's all different now. But the story read, elderly people whose pneumonia was treated according to professional guidelines were far more likely to die than other patients. It concludes a study. Dr. Mark Loeb said, "This is a mystery why patients who underwent the recommended course of antibiotics had 3 times the death rate and symptoms that lasted longer than those who did not." That is awkward. That is hard to explain away. The fact that so many of these things happen and do not get noticed. We may have invented evidence-based medicine, but we haven't completely converted to it. And so there's a lot in the medical mindset that is creating problems. And that's not even to mention the old description of pneumonia as the old man's friend. You know, of course, I want more time. We all want more time. I'm prepared to die gracefully in old age. It's just old age is 20 years from now, whenever it may happen to be. But at the same time, this idea that we don't let nature take its course, that somehow through magic we can reanimate someone who is fundamentally a living corpse. That's a strange thing to be trying to do. And in my view, the success is worse than the failure. But there are also these failures in therapies that we think work. We think, oh yeah, pneumonia antibiotics. That one we've got wired. But there's some curious indications out there. Another interesting example, this is Theodore Dalrymple, again 2004, so you might say, well, yeah, but that was in the Dark Ages. He said, interestingly, the technological refinements of the past few decades have not increased the proportion of correct diagnoses proved at post-mortem, suggesting that technological sophistication may have been accompanied by a decline in personal skill among physicians. Which again, assumes that, yeah, we're on the right track. We got this. It's just sloth and stupidity among practitioners. But maybe the problem runs deeper. Maybe we don't completely understand the human condition or its frailties. As I mentioned last time, that somebody whose elderly father-in-law was taking 12 different medications and probably should have just thrown them all out and drunk a beer, although again, they did not manage to kill him until he was quite elderly. But when you think to yourself, we have diagnosed this man and he has got 12 different diseases, and for each of these, you know, it's like we've solved the crossword. We fill in all 12 clues and it all fits together. That may be a very fundamental misunderstanding. And here, you know, the old joke about the wonder drug, we give it to him, wonder what will happen. But part of the problem here is that we do have this idea that medicine is about detecting symptoms and finding chemicals that will make each of the symptoms go away. And if we do that, you're better. And that is possibly an appropriate way to fix a machine. But I don't think that it's a very good way to deal with an organism. And I think it's a very bad way to deal with a soul that happens to be clothed in flesh. So this is where the question becomes, just how far off track might we be? And one of the consequences of this is the joke about side effects. And of course, one of the reasons that medications have these hair-raising side effects is that they're trying to protect themselves from lawsuits. They're not really saying what is likely to happen to you if you should take this medication, but they do need to say, just in case this happens to somebody, we need to put on the label, oh yeah, you know, This could be 10 times worse than the disease. One of my favorites of these is from a Better Half cartoon where this ad comes on TV and it says, if you're suffering from freckles, ask your doctor about Zox. Side effects may include male pregnancy, spontaneous combustion, face loss, and navel weeds. So obviously that's pretty bad, right? Navel weeds. But there was also a story that appeared in a number of publications, again in 2004, that said one of the hottest selling drugs for treating high blood pressure actually may increase the risk of heart attacks, Canadian researchers say. Their article, published in the British Medical Journal, warns that though angiotensin II receptor blockers, or ARBs, reduce blood pressure, they do not reduce the risk of heart attack. In fact, ARBs appear to increase the risk by almost 20%, which I can't help thinking it would have been a good idea to notice. And I also feel that if I went into my doctor's office and they said, you've got high blood pressure and we must treat it, we must get rid of this symptom or you're going to have, I would think they were almost certainly going to say a heart attack or a stroke. I don't know what else might happen with high blood pressure. I suppose I could leak blood through my pores. But fundamentally, I would assume that's what we're on about here. So you create a medicine that treats the symptom but aggravates the actual problem, and you don't notice it. Again, it kind of suggests that people are thinking about the problem slightly wrongly. And then there was another story 3 years later. Health Canada is issuing fresh warnings to doctors not to prescribe a popular weight loss drug to people at risk of serious heart-related side effects. The agency has received 65 reports of irregular heartbeat, high blood pressure, heart attack, and other cardiovascular reactions suspected of being associated with Meridia since January 2001. And, again, I personally could use a little weight loss, but I don't want to lose all of it suddenly. And so that's a kind of an example of a pill for every ill that is just gives you a feeling that there's something quite off about what they're trying to do and how. Because for one thing, if you need to lose weight, maybe you shouldn't be taking a pill. Maybe you should be taking a walk. Just saying. Again, as I mentioned in the last lecture, it's really more apropos to today, but one of the reasons why medicine doesn't work, let's be fair to it, is patience. Patients don't follow it. Patients do all kinds of loopy things. And one that's not exactly patience, but it's just an example of human folly. And, since you're a doctor, I sympathize with the fact that one of your problems is you're trying to treat human beings and we're idiots, is, of course, one of the great health triumphs was putting fluoride in the water. This has had the effect of enormously increasing the number of conspiracy theories out there, along with the healthy teeth. But because human beings are human beings, there's great triumph of medicine, the tap water doesn't kill you, right? This sanitation, hygiene, safe drinking water. What humankind has wanted since at least the end of the last ice age, here it is. So what do people do? They pay extra for water in a plastic bottle. And one of the problems is that bottled water is not fluoridated. And there's actually been something of an increase in cavities, apparently, due to increased drinking of bottled water instead of tap water. So good luck getting those people to follow even the advice that actually is good. But there are other things that are a little bit troubling. Again, some of these stories are from a while back. This is 2001. A story that between 5 and 10% of people on dialysis die every year. And again, you start multiplying out 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9, you realize that if you're on dialysis, your odds aren't good. And some of those people, and if they hadn't been on dialysis, they'd have died this year. Some of them, certainly it prolongs their life and not much could be done. But for others, you think to yourself, there's more to this than meets the eye. There's, in some way, we're improving things on the surface and we're undermining them further down, or the medical profession is not paying attention as it ought to be. They just figure you're plugged into the machine, we follow the protocols, you'll be fine. And when they die, they say, okay, hook up the next guy. Again, little bit of a problem. It's also a problem, I might add, that surgery is as unregulated as it is. People are working on improving this, but there is something of a wild west of the operating room. And one reason why is that doctors don't like to be told what to do, especially not surgeons. This idea, as with airline pilots, when they started to bring in these safety check protocols, and the pilots said, we're offended, we're professionals, we're not stupid, we don't need to go through this dumb checklist. But they were persuaded, well, try it and see. And indeed, the rate of accidents went down and the rate of stupid errors that occurred, not because you were inexperienced, but because you're so experienced and all got routine, did come down. And so they're making some efforts with doctors to get them to do that too. And I think there's been some success. But there's also an extent to which doctors are just doing what they think they should do, and there's much less evidence-based monitoring than there ought to be. But to the extent that that's true, it's a failure of modern technique. It's not a failure in modern technique. It's just not applying it properly. But here I thought was an interesting story. Again, this is from 2003. A patient's odds of surviving high-risk surgery are dramatically improved if his or her surgeon performs operations frequently. Success rates that are up to 400% better than their colleagues operating less frequently, according to a study in today's edition of the New England Journal of Medicine. And in the first place, why is anybody surprised? Practice makes perfect. Did we not know that? Except there's this theory that an operation is a thing and a doctor is a person skilled in doing these things. Again, as I mentioned last time, the nurses know which doctor they don't want working on them. But it's astonishing that it would take until 2003 for someone to do a study and write an article and say, hey, you know what, some doctors only do it occasionally. They don't do it that well. There's really no surprise there, except that there's a surprise there. And that suggests something odd about the modern mindset. And even scarier is nosocomial illness. And we still don't have any idea how bad that is. We're starting to get some idea of the superbugs in hospitals. And you remember, again, last time I talked about the Hungarian physician who discovered that doctors should wash their hands while delivering babies. And this wasn't a problem for midwives. When people were giving birth at home, the conditions for spreading puerperal fever weren't there, although there were obviously other issues. But a lot of the stuff that hospitals have learned to prevent is stuff that hospitals caused. And again, it seems to me fairly clear that COVID-19 got into the retirement homes via the hospitals. And that's a pretty major failing. There's a significant lapse in how people thought about interactions with and within the system. And in retrospect, they're going to be fairly obvious, but they weren't ahead of time. And there's many other things where I think we still don't quite understand how much harm scientific medicine is actually doing to people. I'm not quite sure where to place all the lifestyle illnesses we now suffer from. They're not the fault of medicine, right? If I decide I'm going to lose weight, so I start to eat carbs, and I start to eat muffins, and I become one, it's not my doctor's fault. But in the larger sense, if modern medicine is managing to cure or contain a number of things that modernity unleashed on us, there is at least some suspicion that modernity, writ large, is culpable, even if doctors themselves are not. And one of these is, and once you think about it, you find that you're not surprised, and maybe the lockdown will help here. Modern offices, they're germ incubators. It's just astounding. And again, there was a story in the Washington Post about a University of Arizona microbiologist who discovered that the average office desk contains about 400 times more bacteria than the average toilet seat. And when you think what you wouldn't do on a toilet seat, and then you think what you would do on an office desk, that's a pretty alarming finding, though. Again, we can't pin that on medicine. But now I want to pin some things on medicine. I want to talk about things that medicine has done that, in my view, have been very characteristically modern, abysmal failures. And it has to do not so much with men without chests as it does men without heads. I don't want to rant on endlessly about psychiatrists now, but yeah, I do, actually. I want to rant on endlessly about psychiatrists because there's a kind of modern medicine that is very typically modern and, as far as I can see, has been essentially worse than useless. I don't use the term lightly, worse than useless. And it's not alone, men without heads, because I think two of the great failures of modern medicine have taken place above the neck. And one of them is psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychology, and the other one is pharmacology, the proliferation of what are loosely called happy pills. So apparently, I had a relative who was addicted to these things, who was one of the most unpleasant human beings who ever lived. So if those were happy pills, somebody had put on the wrong label. But the reason why medicine has done so much so badly in this realm, again, it's the ghost of the machine. What's inside our heads? This thinking, morally responsible, choosing actor is not to be respected, strengthened in character development. It is an illusion to be banished. And that is a very natural thing for modern medicine to try and do, but disastrously so. And that's revealing. We're going to fix the machine. That's what other medicine is going to fix the body, right? But meanwhile, particular branches of medicine are going to exercise that ghost to make sure he stays away. I think I may have mentioned in a lecture in a previous year a line, my old school colleague at the Ottawa Citizen, Charles Gordon, he was an old-time journalist. He was a journalist back when newspapers made money. That's how old school he was. And he wrote a novel about the media business in which one of the characters said, "The Dirty Vicar is the best story there is." And once upon a time, I think that was true. The guardian of our highest values, who themselves fails to live up to them, revealing the perils of the human condition, the hypocrisies of the social order, all that stuff. Just the kind of thing that journalists would like to find out back then. But I thought to myself at the time, and I've thought it ever more strongly since, the modern equivalent of that, the best story there is today, is the mad psychiatrist, right? Hannibal Lecter. There is a figure for our times. And of course, the most remarkable thing about Hannibal Lecter, he's portrayed as, he's oh so cultured and sophisticated. He eats people because they bore and annoy him because they're vulgarians. He reads Plato and Aristotle between bouts of biting your nose off. But one thing about Lecter, the brilliant psychologist, the superb chef, the cultured appreciator of music, the man who blends his own hand cream and stuff like that, he is not only unable to cure himself, he doesn't even want to. He has seen to the heart of modernity and realized that sanity is an illusion and what you want to do is enjoy being mad. Certainly a person like that is not going to succeed in curing us. And there was a story about a man named Armin Meuss, the cannibal of Rothenburg, who did something I just can't even talk to you about. But he claimed he was guilty of mercy killing because the guy that he killed wanted to be killed, which is apparently true. And then they had a prison psychiatrist say he was in good psychological health. We all have fantasies, live two lives, but in the case of Herr Meuss, the double life was more pronounced. And then the prison psychiatrist went on to say, "This is my complaint about Herr Meuss. If a man asks to be killed, you have a duty to persuade him to seek professional help." And I presume he meant professional help from a euthanist, not from a chef, since part of the killing was that he ate parts of the man. But why? Why do you have a duty to persuade him to seek that kind of professional help? If a man wants to be killed, isn't the idea that he should be killed? And why, that being the case, would sautéing be off the menu, so to speak? And the reason we get into this incredibly murky and appalling territory so quickly is this line of Marshall McLuhan's about Freudian analysis and related kinds of theories. McLuhan said, "It is often said that the major development of this century has been the discovery of the night world of dreams. By day, we are the bottom half of a double boiler. We are all steamed up, but we don't know what's cooking." And this, of course, is characteristic of modernity, that having turned its withering gaze upon all manner of assumptions, preconceptions, and old habits, it eventually got to the point of turning its withering gaze on reason itself. And when it did so, it found that reason could not be justified. The trouble with modernity is that it engages in a critique of pure reason, which succeeds. It convinces itself that reason itself is just one more internally consistent, but not grounded set of axioms. And then it tries to reason itself out of this hole with no bottom. Again, the subconscious per se might be just more hocus pocus, although if Freud was even close to being right about what it is that motivates us, the dirty origins of all our thoughts mustn't necessarily also be true of his. As C.S. Lewis has argued repeatedly, and I think very lucidly, we couldn't think our way out of that hole because all our thoughts would be just more reflections of some fundamentally irrational drives and processes. Freudian psychology is just one more sublimated way to murder our father and then do something even worse. What else could it possibly be? And I don't know why you'd spend a lot of time sitting around talking about it, like the deconstructionists who say words have no meaning and then don't shut up. But again, Hannibal Lecter has taken it to its logical conclusion. He has no desire to get better because there is no better. Freud still had one foot in the 19th century, though he had the other one somewhere I don't want to talk about. And again, you could just say, well, okay, but Freud was, well, if I say he's nuts, I'll get letters from cashews, but say, okay, maybe it was helpful that he raised some of these questions, but his answers were completely off the beam, and never mind Freud, he was another mad psychiatrist, which I think is fair enough. Apparently at one point he called himself a conquistador. Strange. And Lewis himself said, "I have found that when Freud is talking off his own subject, and on a subject I do know something about, he's very ignorant." Freud also, one foot in the 19th century, said, "I consider ethics to be taken for granted. Actually, I have never done a mean thing." Oh, really? A lifetime of seeking insights into oneself, and you come up with that? I don't know about that. It was a close friend of his who invented biorhythms, and Freud believed them and stuff. And he really hated it when people disagreed with him. And when he was warned in the 1930s to get out of Austria, Freud said, "No, you're obsessed with the Nazis. Our real enemy is the Roman Catholic Church." Thank you very much. What's worse, Freud's theory that people are secretly having these fantasies, if in fact what was happening is that they had been molested, he is blaming the victim in one of the most ugly ways imaginable. But again, I don't want to go on and on about Freud, because you could just say, yeah, okay, Freud asked some good questions, but he gave some terrible answers. We've moved on. And not just to Carl Jung, who once said his closest childhood friend was a rock. Now we'll get letters from rocks. Though apparently Jung himself was molested as a boy. And he once said that he said that Christians are wrong to mistake worship God as a trinity. They should worship him as a quaternity, the fourth person being Satan. Thanks for that. And Jung actually was kind of anti-Jewish and pro-Aryan. So again, we've moved on. To what, though? Alfred Kinsey? I mean, there's a guy with problems that, again, I cannot decently describe them in this lecture. He was a man of obscene fantasies and practices, and his path-breaking studies about sexual behavior used extremely unrepresentative samples, people who were far more likely to have engaged in what would once have been called deviant behavior. He never talked about love. He said, no one knows how to approach it scientifically, so I've avoided the mess of it. Yeah, approach it scientifically. But he did say if people told the whole truth about human sexual behavior, they'd throw aside their hang-ups and realize that all sexual desires were healthy. All sexual desires. Well, we can all think of sexual desires that are not healthy, if that's the word you want to use, although I would say not right, without any difficulty. Though Kinsey, I don't know that he could do that. But again, his subjects for his survey were very heavily skewed toward imprisoned sex offenders. Imprisoned sex offenders. Who would pick a sample, apparently, of his 5,300 male subjects? 1,400 were imprisoned sex offenders, except for the purpose of proving that behavior was normal, which in fact was not normal. You'd say, okay, but again, so Kinsey, yeah, never mind Kinsey. But people did mind Kinsey. Hugh Hefner was a fan. Betty Friedan was a fan. Kinsey was enormously influential because he said things that people wanted to hear, and there's no good saying he's just a fringe kook. He was central to popular culture, including in the figure that 1 in 10 people is homosexual. That comes from Kinsey. Well, it may have been true of his subjects, but his subjects were a very skewed bunch. People wanted to think it, and people still cite Kinsey. This is one of the amazing things. People still cite Kinsey. In 2004, Toronto Film Festival, and I quote here from Maclean's magazine, critics breathlessly pronounced this to be the year of the penis. Proud members delivered towering performances in a record number of graphic films, from Anatomy of Hell, Catherine Breillat's male-bashing diatribe, to the Raspberry Reich, Bruce LaBruce's trifle of gay agit porn. And he specifically praises Kinsey, tells the fascinating story of the American sexologist who interviewed thousands of Americans about their erotic activities, shattering taboos by challenging notions of what's normal. Directed by Bill Condon of Gods and Monsters, Liam Neeson constructs a dynamic yet gently nuanced portrait of Kinsey that should make him a leading Oscar contender. So there you go. And, of course, psychiatry has moved on, but it has moved on very much in the direction of endorsing all kinds of things of which Kinsey was a fan. They have abolished the notion of normal. They've gotten rid of gender at this point. And they've basically said, if it feels good, do it. And what else can you say when you've decided that the moral actor inside our heads is just a trick of the genes? So this is not psychiatry gone wrong. This is not because Kinsey was a weirdo or Jung or Freud. This was going to happen if you took that as your model of human beings. And they definitely did. And so this was somebody writing in National Review. Of course, Timothy McVeigh had deep-seated psychological motivations. Doesn't everybody for everything? That's a conservative writing there. As G.K. Chesterton said, the historians of a future time will probably describe the present as a psychological age. It is rather a desperate period in which men deny both the spiritual and the rational guide to life. But, Alice C.S. Lewis, I do not see how you could deny only one and not the other. There is no way to manage the divine invasion of reason. If the only way we can measure our minds is against our minds and our minds are flawed, it's like putting a bent ruler against itself. How do you see that it's bent? But psychiatry is certainly not open to the notion that absolute truth is coming in from outside thanks to a omniscient and loving creator God. So it's rather stuck with this notion that spirituality and rationality are illusions. Does the name Pavlov ring a bell? Yeah, that's a dad joke. But I didn't think of it. That's from Government Magazine. But let me hear a quote from a noted linguist, a Canadian-born who ended up a senator from California, S.I. Hayakawa, in his book Language and Thought and Action, which went through umpteen editions from the 1940s through 1991. And he wrote, what all this boils down to then is that poetry, along with the other arts, whether it be good or bad, and at whatever level of crudity or refinement, exists to fulfill a necessary biological function for a symbol-using class of life, that of helping us to maintain psychological health and equilibrium. Not to find truth, not to find beauty, but to maintain a psychological health and equilibrium. And, he throws out that line, whether it be good or bad. But what possible criterion does he have other than whether it allows us to maintain psychological equilibrium? And what's psychological equilibrium? It's not a moral state. It isn't virtuousness. Hannibal Lecter was in psychological equilibrium. And there was nothing to be said to reproach him. And if you tried, he would fillet you. As Bill Maher once put it, everything that used to be a sin is now a disease. And so here's a story from the Ottawa Citizen, 2006. To you, that angry, horn-blasting tailgater is suffering from road rage, but doctors have another name for it, intermittent explosive disorder. And a new study suggests it is far more common than they realized, affecting up to 16 million Americans. People think it's bad behavior and that you just need an attitude adjustment, but what they don't know is there's a biology and cognitive science to this, said Dr. Emil Coccaro, chairman of psychiatry at the University of Chicago's Medical School. And then somebody said that people who use UV tanning beds are addicts. And the school wanted to provide counseling for the bullies as well as the victims. And a lot of people have seen through this. Again, this is a Better Half cartoon where the guy says, they rejected my insurance claim. A crushed ego doesn't qualify as a job-related injury. Chesterton had Flambeau at one point say, don't you know what psychology means? Psychology means being off your chump. And then there's a gag again. This is Sam Goldwyn. Anybody who goes to a psychiatrist should have his head examined. And Chesterton again called psychiatry confession without absolution, which I think really nails it. But it's also important to say that studies of whether psychiatry actually does anybody any good have tended to suggest that it probably doesn't. Because you're digging in the wrong place, you don't find the treasure. But all this trauma counseling and grief therapy, apparently it makes it worse, not better, because it encourages you to be soft and helpless and thrash around in your feelings of inadequacy instead of sucking it up, pulling yourself together, and facing down life's troubles. And again, if it's got the wrong view of human beings, how could it not? There was another story which I want to talk about here from the Ottawa Sun just about 6 years ago about a sex offender. She was a teen pimp sex boss, and she was given 6.5 years in jail for exploiting teen girls starting when she was 15. But a forensic psychiatrist report found the teen to be a sociopathic narcissist so entrenched in her ways, doctors would need 5 to 10 years of work to break through her defenses. You see, they don't say to get her to see that she was rotten and to try and be a better person, but to break through a set of psychological defenses in order to rearrange things so that the machine of the brain would work better, as in most cases it's the machine of the body. Whereas Chesterton, on the other hand, said to say that there are no devils is really to say that human beings are devils. But we're deeply invested in this. Here's another story that I thought was very revealing. This is from the Globe and Mail 9 years ago. Somalia's mental anguish. After 20 years of war, millions of Somalis suffer from mental health disorders. With just 3 psychiatrists to serve them, their pain is often permanent. Right, so what if there were 100,000 psychiatrists? Would having their country be ravaged by war and people being massacred and raped and all the horrors that go along with that? It would just take a few sessions on the couch and you'd be fine? But the assumption apparently is yes. It's just amazing. That's just the psychologist. Now let me get to the happy pills here, because I realize I'm going a bit over time and you can't stop me. Theodore Dalrymple, a line that has just stayed with me ever since I read it, which would have been back in 2003. At least in Britain, anyone who voices to his doctor any kind of dissatisfaction with his life is likely to leave the office clutching a prescription for antidepressants. For we have a right not to the pursuit of happiness, but to the thing itself, and if our way of life leads us to misery, then a pill will, indeed ought and must, put everything right. And he says, I very rarely see a patient who's in a dreadful personal situation in which it is inconceivable that he or she should be happy who has not been prescribed these drugs. In effect, they have been issued a promissory note that is false, almost fraudulent. The drugs are handed out almost at once to mourners for someone they've known for 30 or more years. Again, there's an internal logic to this. The machine is meant to be in equilibrium. The machine is out of equilibrium. We can put it in equilibrium. And we don't have to mess around inside the head and talk about dreams and do all that stuff. We just have to treat the chemical imbalance. We take the symptom of the unhappiness, which is the chemistry. We fix the chemistry, and that does the trick. And so it is that pharmaceutical man has become a reality. It is someone, who's this here? Michael Pollan in the New York Times. It is sometimes said that in the last few decades, psychiatry went from being brainless, relying on talk therapies oblivious to neurobiology, to being mindless, relying on drugs with little attention to the constraints of consciousness. And again, modernity looks at a machine and doesn't just ask, how do we make this one work the way it should when it left the factory? They ask how to make a better one. And that's where Lewis' conquest of nature comes and bites us. Just at the moment that we stop believing in morality or absolute truth, we realize we can do anything. And the only basis for what we do is some kind of whim, something that comes out of instinct or impulse. And thus nature wins. But pharmaceutical man, how about pharmaceutical child? Here's a story from 2004. Last week, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that 10 million children in the United States took prescription medication for 3 months or longer in 2002. And stories out of Canada also have been very good on this, especially Sharon Kirky at the Ottawa Citizen. Prescriptions for some of the most powerful psychiatric drugs on the market, so-called second-generation antipsychotics, or SGAs, to youth 18 and under increased 18-fold in British Columbia alone between 1996 and 2011, a new study finds, with some of the highest increases in prescriptions to boys as young as 6. Skin patches with Ritalin. Oh my goodness. Another study about children in the United States. Use of antidepressants among children of all ages grew by 48% from 1998 to 2002. The fastest growing segment were under 5 years of age. What? And again, antidepressants. Why do you take an antidepressant? Because you're not meant to be depressed. You're meant to be in psychological equilibrium, and it doesn't matter what horrors may be going on in your life. You have a right to be happy. But there's more to it than that. What if they could invent a pill that would, rather than curing depression, would just take you, the not depressed you, and make you better, make you smarter, improve your memory, cause you to be more compassionate? If they could do these things, why should they not do them? Why not make a better human machine? Apparently there's a drug called modafinil, which is typically used to treat sleep disorders, that is a cognitive enhancer. So why not take it? Well, one reason why, another study found that meditation was almost as good as the antidepressants at treating depression. It's as good as, which is not totally illogical, since the problem often is in the soul and not in the mind. Also, a story that came out in 2015, it was in the National Post. Antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs provide so little benefit that doctors could stop writing 98% of all prescriptions without causing harm, a Danish expert argues this week in a leading medical journal piece. It's in the British Medical Journal, flawed trials, company-funded studies, blah, blah, blah. But again, all the Ritalin and stuff, as one person put it brutally, drug therapy is a replacement for parenting. Over the past decade, the production of Ritalin has increased 700%. That's a story from 2004. The company even created a Mr. Potato Head lookalike called Ritalin Man. Really? Oh, my goodness. But again, when you think about what medicine can do, and you think about all the things that medicine can do to restore functioning, like some child's going to be born with a hole in their heart. We're not meant to have holes in our hearts. Microsurgery can fix it. Of course you'd want to do that. If gene therapy could prevent someone from being born with a debilitating neurological disease, of course you'd want to do that. But if you are of an older view, all of these things are tied to making a person be what a person is meant to be. If you're untethered from that, how do you know where to stop? Why not give everybody a child who's 6'6", looks like a fashion model, and has the IQ of Albert Einstein? If you can do it, what's the argument against it? Why not give everybody a pill that makes them happy all the time? It's maybe cheaper than actually creating a situation in which people are happy. Certainly quicker, gets them out of your office. Why would you not do it? And I'm not saying don't drink coffee before playing chess. But I am saying don't take a pill that would cause you permanently to increase your IQ by 20 points, because then it's somebody else playing chess or something else. Something that looks human and ought to be human but isn't. And that, to me, is a very bad thing. But again, if you embrace the tenets of modernity, why would you not do that? And of course, one of the ways in which we're seeing this now is the transgendered. If someone says, I feel that I am not what I look like, instead of saying, well, we can help you to be at home in your body, we say, gosh, no problem. There are 63 genders and we can give you hormones for that. But if you can do that for someone who really does have this kind of gender dysphoria, why not do it for somebody else? What if someone says, well, at the moment I'm fine, but I just think it would be cool to switch? On what possible basis would you tell them not to? Or I want to be in between. I want to slide around. Why shouldn't you? What's wrong with that? What's the argument against it? If we can do it, why should we not do it? And by the way, if you haven't seen Bill Nye the Science Guy gyrating to the song My Sex Junk, I don't recommend it. If you're not familiar with the lyrics to My Sex Junk, you might want to pause the video and fast forward, but I'll recite a few of them. I can do it. You can take it. Drag queen, drag king, just do what feels right. You're a tall, pansexual, flirty wood sprite who enjoys a fleshlight in the cold moonlight. And I'm going to flatter you and myself by saying I didn't know what that meant until I Googled it, and I presume you don't know what it means and don't Google it. But again, why not be better than life? Why not have 7 sexes? Why not take Everlove? That's from Logan's Run, the book, not the movie. Why not do all these things if we can? And why not give people happy pills? Here's a story from 2002. University of Calgary researchers found 97% of healthy people they studied had insufficient levels of the vitamin D sometime during the year, a deficit which could lead to thinning bones and fractures. So again, that it's a small thing, but normal levels of vitamin D aren't healthy, and medicine is going to give you other levels of vitamin D. You know, start small. That may well be rational. I frankly have vitamin D pills in my cupboard, but where does it stop? Well, how about hormone replacement? There was a Globe and Mail story, which was in 2002. It said a study of 16,600 women between 50 and 79 by the Women's Health Initiative in the U.S. in the Journal of the American Medical Association said hormone replacement therapy increased the risk of breast cancer by 26%, stroke by 41%, and heart attacks by 29%, and added hundreds of thousands of Canadian women do it. Yes, indeed. Another story. No, same story, sorry. Drug companies sold 12.5 million prescriptions of synthetic estrogens and progesterones, separately or in combined variations in Canada in 2001, according to the health information firm IMS Health. Total sales worth $293 million. Because what? Menopause. It's not a failure. It's what the machine does. But the machine should do something else, and we can make it do something else. And menopause, as you know, is not merely a physical condition. It has an emotional and psychological component. So there we are, better than life. There's a pill for being a woman. We can fix that. Actually, there are quite a few. And is the problem just the side effects? Well, that's what people think. In the 1970s, researchers found that estrogen therapy alone increased the risk of uterine cancer, so they added progestin. Margaret Wente was writing about this and quoted a friend, hormone therapy is better than nature. And then Wente said, personally, I have no trouble with artificial interventions that will keep me young and healthy. Okay, how young? How healthy? For how long? What if science could come along and give me not just the body that I had when I was 25, but the body I wished I'd had? Why should I not go to New You and, at the age that I am now, which I'm not going to mention, why shouldn't I be tall and handsome and wrinkle-free? There was that guy in Europe who said if he could change his sex, he should be able to change his age. He wanted to change his age so he'd be younger, so he'd have more luck on dating sites, and he said he thought he looked young. What if they could really make you young? What would be the argument against doing it? Well, another story said from 2002 that there was a operation you could get in Calgary that would stop your menstrual cycle. It took 9 minutes. The doctor said it's a convenient solution for busy career women or women who travel extensively. Of course, it will severely inhibit your ability to have children, but then what if you don't want children? And somebody, a few years back, the dojo was ranting against water bottles that tell you when you're thirsty, and sure enough, I looked online. Glows, the only bottle with lights that flash to remind you to drink more water and to celebrate when you've met your daily goal. If you need a bottle to tell you you're thirsty, you're in a heap of trouble. But don't worry, though. There'll be an intravenous, a skin patch or something. But here's another one. What about love? I'm not necessarily for it in this story. It's from 2017. It started out, for George Bernard Shaw, it was one of the most violent and insane of all passions. According to University of Oxford researchers, love is literally addictive and may be biochemically curable. Curable. Love may be curable. If you happen to have a habit of making a bad choice of partners, I could see certain advantages to this. But what about just not making bad choices? Love can be curable. Or suppose you're a Christian. We'd probably cure that too. There's probably a pill for that. But in the meantime, suppose you are, and you think, well, we should love one another more. What if a pill could make you love more? You see, there's a brave new world out here that is terrifying, but it's very hard to see how you'd avoid it. Or how about a pill to cure a hangover? And you know the old Spanish proverb, take what you want, says God, but pay for it. But what if, and in fact, it wasn't actually a pill, it was Pedalite. It was this drink that was supposed to help rehydrate children, but this researcher and director of sales for some company discovered it after her Sin City bachelorette party. She found that it really helped cure hangovers or prevent them. And so a third of its sales by this point came from grown-ups. And they advertise it. When last night's party threatens to ruin today, those in the know reach for Pedialyte. So Pedialyte. Gatorade also apparently does it. And here's an interesting, if I just throw in a sideline about liquor. I don't know if it's ever struck you that dark-colored liquors tend to have more cachet than clear ones, right? Scotch and brandy are being drunk by the wealthy, and the poor are chugging down gin and vodka. And one reason why is it is harder to drink dark beverages without getting a hangover. So if you're the kind of person who's drinking those ones, you're probably not drinking to excess. But with Pedialyte, we can fix that. But again, this is for amateurs. You know, we all know from these dystopian novels, Soma and Brave New World, Lysergic Foam and Logan's Run. Again, this is the audiobook, not the movie. Drugs with no downside. What about a pill that gives you the happy effects of alcohol but no hangover? Why should you not take it? And people are saying, oh, one professor of psychology said, a lot of studies have shown that people who drink to get intoxicated are trying to manipulate and regulate their emotions. And she says a drug to mimic drunkenness won't help with those problems. But well, you could probably have a pill that makes you not want to do that, or one that makes you not want to drink for fun. You can do anything with your personality, and why wouldn't you? There is no natural guide, and there is no requirement that you do this the old-fashioned way. And so, yes, there's this new phenomenon, cosmetic neurology, the use of drugs among healthy people to manipulate mood, memory, concentration, libido, of course, capacity to learn, and general ability to cope. So you can take antidepressants not because you're depressed, but to become less neurotic. And then here was another one, because not getting enough sleep makes you gain weight, which is a problem for men as they age. And so, according to the Ottawa Citizen 2009, now the researchers are working to see if new types of sleeping pills or hormone injections can slow signs of aging. I like the idea of slowing aging to reduce weight. That's getting your priorities straight. No narcissism there. And of course, we've got safe abortion and euthanasia, which aren't very safe for the clients necessarily, but You see, all these kind of things that are going on out there have to do with making the human being better than the human being, of being better than life. And when we don't have natural boundaries to this kind of behavior, it's very hard to think of any. I've mentioned before the problem with ethicists is they always say, do what thou wilt, which is what we knew they were going to say, which is why we give them prestige and money and ask for their opinion on things. But from the happy pills to the kind of genetic enhancements that are going to become easier and more common as we go along. The happy couple's going to come in and say, doctor, we're going to have a baby. We want blonde hair. We want 6'2". We want a broad chest. We want an IQ of 140. And the doctor's going to dial it all up and zoom, in it goes. CRISPR can do it for you. How do we stop them? This is one of the things that really scares me about modern medicine. Now, as I mentioned, there are other things about modern medicine that one could say, including that in many cases it has failed of its promise, at least in part. And one of these, and it's always dangerous talking to doctors about this because I might say something really stupid and you'll know it and you'll say something. But this idea about ulcers, that we were so sure for so long that stress caused ulcers. I remember one Major League Baseball manager saying about one of his pitchers, he doesn't have ulcers, but he's a carrier. And then it turned out that many of them, at least, are actually a bacteriological infection. You'd have thought that would have been detected sooner because people would have been treating them, people for stress and not having their ulcers go away and so on. But here's another one. This is a story from the Globe and Mail 2003. Stressful jobs increase your chances of getting flu, gastroenteritis, and other acute infections, reports Focus magazine. Dutch researchers quizzed 8,000 employees over 3 years and discovered links between working patterns and illness. The Maastricht University scientists found that those who suffered from stress came down with gastroenteritis twice as much as other employees. And again, if you think of Dorothy Parker's, Dorothy Sayre, two very different people, her crossword puzzle, you think of these diseases as being specific things with specific causes and specific symptoms there in that clue box. This is in this clue box. But then you realize that the human body is a very complex organism. And then you think about stress and you realize that stress comes primarily not from the fact that you are currently running through the forest with a saber-toothed tiger after you, but from imbalances in your moral life. And then you realize that the embodied soul has not just a more complicated set of problems than you might have realized, but a very different set of problems than you might have thought if your job was to fix the machine while banishing the ghost. And so that's where I think modern medicine is likely to go most wrong. And again, a notable group of psychiatrists is recommending a novel new treatment for moderate depression that they appears to be tolerated well, yoga. And they say jogging, swimming, dancing, brisk walking, or any form of aerobic exercise that increases breathing and heart rate also work. This is a paradigm shift, said Dr. Arun Ravindran, a senior scientist at Toronto Centre for Addiction and Medical Health. And then he said, and more power to him, but very important, we're starting to listen to the people we treat. So that's getting us back into a much more logical direction. And again, as I said in the last lecture about don't think that the patients always believe what they were being told. There's a story about Pete Conrad. He was an Apollo astronaut. And, of course, they were given the usual panoply of pseudoscientific tests at that time, including being a Rorschach test. So the NASA psychiatrist shows him one of these pictures, and he goes, "You're holding it upside down." So there's that. But I want to conclude by quoting ancients and moderns alike. G.K. Chesterton, how could he be so far ahead of his time? This is in 1929. There will be no future for the modern psychology until it again studies the old moral theology. And as Leon Kass pointed out in First Things in 2001, are psychiatrists whose name means healers of the soul. Healers of the soul. That's where modern medicine has gone wrong. Fundamentally, in both its glorious successes, in its technical failures, and in those failures that arise from it succeeding in doing the wrong thing, it has all arisen from a failure to grasp that what they are doing is treating embodied souls, and that our ultimate destination is not nirvana here on earth, and that we would better be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. So I think I shall give the last word to Thomas Szasz. Medicine is a natural science. Psychiatry is not. It is a moral science. Okay, I'm not going to give him the last word. I'm going to take it for myself, and you can't stop me. Well, you can in the question and answer period, but we'll get to that. Medicine is a moral science, too. It is good that people should be healthy. That is why we care about it. But it is good that they should be healthy humans, that they should have those attributes that it is right for a person to have, and very often the best way to get them those attributes is to have them do the things that it is right for a human to do, to take time out from their day, to meditate, to exercise, to have a sense of priorities. So much of what ails us could be fixed by right ordering of our lives. Now, some of the rest of it can be solved by technique. I don't want to suggest that this explosion of knowledge coming out of the method of rational inquiry that succeeded so well in so many areas for so many centuries and finally came to work in medicine doesn't work, or that in many cases it should not work. In all those areas where a human being is deprived of the natural attributes and qualities of a human being, if medicine can give it back to them, that's terrific. We set a broken leg, and now we can, as I said, fix a hole in a heart. There are a great many things that we can do to make humans better humans. But if we don't have that final qualification, if we try to make them better, and our standard is not what a human being ought to be, if we do not believe there's such a thing as ought, then we are going to make monsters. We will have failures where we make dead monsters, dead humans. But the worst part will be our successes. So that, to my way of thinking, is where modern medicine has gone wrong. It has often failed to notice that its treatments weren't working because it has proceeded on the assumption that it was fixing a machine, and it has been remarkably resistant to evidence-based assessment of a lot of the ways it was trying to treat the machine. But that line about we've started to listen to the people we're treating, that is where medicine needs to go. I think it's where medicine can go, and I think that to the extent that it does that, it will overcome a great many of its failings. Not all of them, because, you can't cure life. Nobody gets out of life alive. But it can treat us a lot better while we're here, fail to inflict many, many horrors on us, from shortening life to reducing the quality of it, to keeping people alive when, in fact, they're no longer with us. And it can be a much more satisfying profession for the human beings it treats and for the human beings who practice it. So that's how I think modern medicine has gone wrong, is in danger of going even more wrong, and how it can instead, and one hopes very much that it will, go right.